On the evening of May 4, 1982, 13-year-old Terry Ryan literally stormed into his family's home in the suburb of Priven, near the capital of Queensland in northeastern Australia, and told his mother an unbelievable story. According to Terry, he had just been forced by two men to participate in the prolonged torture and murder of his best friend, Peter Aston. Peter's body was buried in a shallow grave in the bush about 60 km south of the New South Wales border. After hearing her son's report, the desperate woman immediately called the police and accompanied her son to the nearest police station. In the early hours of May 5, Terry told his story to a sergeant and a detective from the Queensland Criminal Investigation Branch. Around 4:45 a.m., the officers drove Terry and his mother across the border to New South Wales, to the Tweed Heads police station, where they were joined by the local police chief and a local detective. Following the boys' instructions, they first went to a trash can in the nearby Fox Park and examined its contents. Then they inspected the sink, walls, urinal, and stall of the local public restroom. From there, Terry led his mother and the investigators down a sandy path into the bush. But the path led nowhere. There was no grave in the bush as he had described. After the investigators searched 3 more trails in the bush without success, their patience ran out. If this was a teenage prank, it was a very elaborate one. The 4th trail seemed more promising. Fresh tire tracks were visible on the sandy ground. Suddenly, Terry became excited and enthusiastically led everyone forward. After about 200 meters, the trail opened into a clearing, and the tire tracks disappeared into the bush on the other side. Terry suddenly stopped, pointed at the foliage, and said, "Over there, that's it." The investigators continued, and after leaving the path, they came across a fresh mound of earth in the northeast. This was the grave Terry had spoken of. The mound was covered with small branches and twigs clearly broken from nearby trees. At this point, Terry returned to his mother's arms and wept. As the officers approached the ominous mound and examined the freshly dug earth in the light of dawn, they saw bloodstains on the sand and a large, wet, blood-soaked area in the middle of the disturbed soil. On the sand at the head of the grave in the bush lay a dark sock and a knife in a bundle. Around the grave were many chewed matchsticks. But what the police discovered beneath the grave almost exceeded their imagination. Every part of 13-year-old Peter Aston's naked body had been desecrated. The dead boy was over 2 meters tall and had literally been bent in half so his body would fit into the disproportionately small pit, which was clearly not long enough for him. An autopsy performed later that day at Tweed Heads County Hospital revealed numerous cuts, bruises, abrasions, hematomas, and fractures all over Peter's body. In some places on his head, his hair had been cut short. He had a deep laceration on the back of his head, a bruise on the left side of his head, a skull fracture with brain damage, cigarette burns on the front of his chest, severe damage to his scrotum and genitals, and no pubic hair. The presence of sand in his nose, trachea, and bronchi was most likely caused by inhalation. Experts speculated that Peter may have died from the skull fracture, but given the sand in his nose, mouth, trachea, and bronchi, it was more likely that he suffocated after being buried. After Terry recovered from the shock of seeing the place where his best friend had died, he was able to tell the police all the details of the previous day. The 2 boys had met at school and lived not far from each other. Shortly before Peter's death, they had become close friends. Peter was tall and suffered from myopia, which was why he had worn glasses since childhood. The combination of his thick glasses and lanky build made him the target of ridicule at school, so Peter and Terry spent most of their time skipping class and shoplifting. On May 4, he and Peter decided to skip school. Peter wanted to hitchhike to his hometown of Melbourne to see his older brother. Terry agreed to accompany him as far as the Gold Coast and then return home. Around 8:30 a.m., They met under the name Sands and went to a nearby lake for a swim. By 10:30 a.m., they were at the Kingston train station and boarded a train to Brisbane. The boys then got off at the Brownswood Street station and went to a shopping mall where they bought shoes, jeans, and a shirt. From there, they took the train to Woodridge, where Peter stole a pack of cigarettes from Kmart. Then they took the train to Binley, where they each bought a jacket at Kohl's. By noon, the boys went to the Gold Coast Highway to continue their hitchhiking journey. Along the way, they saw a yellow Daihatsu with four-wheel drive and an open hood. One man was bent over the engine and another sat in the passenger seat. The boys approached the car and asked the men if they could take them to the coast. The man at the hood told them to get in, as he was almost done with the repairs and they would leave soon. So Terry and Peter found themselves in a car with two strangers. Terry described the men as both dressed in jeans and sweaters, calling themselves Bob and Paul. Bob was much older than Paul, who sat next to Peter, while Terry sat in the back next to Paul. At first, everything seemed fine, but as soon as the car started moving, Paul pulled out a gun from under a blanket on the floor and held it to Terry's head. After driving for a while, Bob pulled the car over to the side of the road. Paul warned Peter that he would get a bullet in the head or back if he moved. The men took handcuffs from their pockets and alternately cuffed Peter's hands on the passenger seat and then Terry's hands in front of him. The car then sped back onto the highway. After a while, Peter told the men his arms were getting tired, so Bob stopped, removed the handcuffs, and chained him to the dashboard bar. During the drive, Bob slapped Peter for no reason, and Paul jabbed him in the chin with the barrel of his gun. Paul also punched Terry in the face. The car then crossed the border into New South Wales, and Bob drove into thick bushland before stopping. In Terry's words, the incident unfolded as follows. Paul got out, walked to the other side of the car, and pulled Terry out. He forced him to spread his legs by placing his hands on the car roof, and after searching him, he cuffed his hands. Bob removed Peter's handcuffs, pulled him out of the car, and threw him to the ground. Both were then dragged roughly across the ground to the shore, where they were forced to lie face down with their legs spread and arms outstretched. First, they stripped Peter of all his clothes. Peter resisted, but it was useless. Terry was then forced to lie on his stomach with his hands cuffed behind his back and watch as they began beating Peter. Terry heard a cracking sound. It was the rifle stock Paul used to smash Peter's jaw so hard it broke. After letting Peter rest for a while, they began stabbing him with knives they had pulled from their pockets. They had about 5 knives in total. Peter tried to scream, but they gagged him with his torn shirt. Bob then walked over to Terry and punched him in the face, making his nose bleed. Bob took a leather stamp from his pocket and gave it to Paul, who used it to strike both of Peter's ears. Bob then forced Terry to lean over the bleeding Peter and perform oral sex on him. While doing this, Bob cut off several of Peter's pubic hairs, shoved them into Terry's mouth, and forced him to swallow them. At some point, when Paul and Bob were distracted, Peter managed to stand up and tried to run away. Paul chased him down and knocked him over. Bob tied Peter's toes together and said, "Let's see you run now." Peter got up again and tried to escape, but Paul caught him once more. Bob then took a shovel from the trunk and began hitting Peter on the head. The blows were extremely hard. He struck him with the sharp edge. One of them removed Terry's handcuffs, handed him the shovel, and told him to hit Peter on the head. Terry did so, but as gently as possible to avoid hurting Peter too much. To avoid suffering the same fate as Peter, Terry asked if he could join them. One of them replied, "How can we trust you?" Terry responded, "But you saw me hit him with the shovel, didn't you?" The entire time, Peter just lay on the ground, his blood everywhere. Bob handcuffed Peter and Paul began waving the gun around. Bob then shaved Peter's head while Paul held his legs. After that, Bob stabbed Peter in the head. Peter was nearly dead when Bob took Terry to find a spot to dig. The first location had too many tree roots, so they returned to where Peter lay and began digging there. When they came back, Terry saw Paul standing over Peter, zipping up his pants while Peter simply lay on the ground. They then placed him in the hole and covered him with dirt and branches. Terry later recounted, "After that, they took everything they had, put me in the car, and we drove off. During the drive, they told me they worship Satan and that they had to do this as a sacrifice. Along the way, they stopped, threw Peter's clothes in a trash can, used the restroom, and washed up. Bob threw Peter's hat off a bridge, Paul tossed his glasses in the trash, and then they went to a cafe and bought food. I didn't eat any of it," Terry said. "They wanted to know where I lived. I had a pocket knife in case someone tried to hurt me or something. When we stopped in front of the house, Bob got out, opened the back door, and let me out. Then he shook my hand and made me promise not to tell anyone. He said if I did, the same thing would happen to me. After that, I ran straight home and told my mother what happened, and she called the police." Despite intense questioning, Terry Ryan couldn't remember much. Investigators attributed this to the boy being in shock, but were confident he would recall more details in later interrogations. The fact that the mysterious Paul and Bob had driven Terry home after murdering his friend initially raised police suspicions. However, the discovery of Peter Aston's body in a bush grave eliminated any doubts. Investigators realized they were dealing with two deranged killers who were also naive and stupid. In the early hours of May 6, about 24 hours after Terry Ryan led police to his murdered friend's grave, Robert Panetti was awakened by someone shaking his leg as he slept in his room at an army barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. It was 17-year-old Private Paul Luckman and 34-year-old Corporal Robin Bob Reed. Panetti knew Reed well as they had once shared a room before falling out. Reed had a habit of rooming with every new private who joined the unit. Luckman had arrived about 2 weeks earlier and was immediately placed in Reed's room. Since then, the two had been inseparable. Reed and Luckman were both wearing jackets and jeans, and Reed was clutching his stomach, seemingly in severe pain. Luckman explained that he believed his friend had a severe case of food poisoning and asked Panetti if he could drive them to the nearest hospital outside the base. Panetti agreed, quickly dressed, and the three men left the barracks and headed to Panetti's car parked across the lot. Panetti took the driver's seat. Reed sat beside him and Luckman sat in the back. But as Panetti tried to start the car, he felt the sharp blade of a knife at his throat. Luckman held the handle with his left hand and pressed the blade with his right. He then explained that they needed his car and this was no joke. At this point, Reed had miraculously recovered from his food poisoning. He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his jacket pocket and cuffed Panetti's hands behind his back. Panetti was then dragged out of the car and placed in the back seat. Reed and Luckman went to the trunk of the Daihatsu and began transferring their belongings into Panetti's car. Once finished, they got into Panetti's car and drove off. After about 15 minutes of driving, Luckman suddenly turned to Panetti and said, "The guy who was killed at the Gold Coast, that was us." By this point, news of Peter Aston's body being found had already made headlines in all local media. As a shocked Panetti processed what he had just heard, Luckman added, "We only did it for fun, but it was a mistake." Later, when they stopped at a gas station, Luckman asked Panetti, "Can I trust you?" and whether he should remove the handcuffs. Panetti said yes. Luckman warned him not to try to escape and outlined their plan. They would drive Panetti's car through Warwick and then drop him off outside town. When they arrived in Warwick, Reed bought 2 newspapers. The front page featured a picture of Peter Aston and a report on his murder. After reading the paper, Luckman was outraged. "Most of what's written here is a load of crap," he said. "The other 13-year-old boy we let go, it says he was dropped off on the street. That's also nonsense. We dropped him off in front of his house. It wasn't 3:30 a.m., it was earlier. And when we got out of the car, he shook our hands." After driving around a bit more, Luckman told Panetti, "We're about to drop you off without doing what Terry did to us." "Who's Terry?" Panetti asked. "The other 13-year-old boy who went to the police," Reed replied. Remarkably, Panetti somehow managed to convince Luckman and Reed that he wouldn't turn them in. Luckman, convinced he could be trusted, gave Panetti $1, some silver, a pack of cigarettes, and a lighter, then told him to get lost. As soon as Panetti was free, he went straight to the nearest police station and reported what had happened. Thanks to this information, Luckman and Reed were arrested that same day at noon. Their car was spotted by a police patrol and backup was called. Local police arrested Bob and Paul without resistance at the nearest checkpoint. On May 5, after questioning Terry Ryan, all local radio stations broadcast a description of the car and its occupants, who responded to the names Bob and Paul. Everyone was warned to stay away from the vehicle and call the police immediately, as the occupants were armed and dangerous. Soon, police received an anonymous tip that the wanted vehicle might belong to two soldiers, 17-year-old Private Paul Luckman and 34-year-old Corporal Robin Bobby Reed, and that the latter might be at an army barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. After the call, a team of NSW investigators arrived at room 29 of Barrack Block N9, but quickly realized no one was there. On a nearby parking lot, they found the Daihatsu described by Terry Ryan. A look inside confirmed that the interior and contents matched the boy's description exactly. Inside the vehicle, investigators found 3 knives and a baton. After examining the car, they searched Reed and Luckman's room. The room was messy and divided into 4 areas, with the 2 front sections occupied by beds. A search of the room uncovered 37 knives of various shapes and sizes displayed in different areas, along with 8 bullets, a saber, a bayonet, and 2 scalpels, all mounted on walls and in a cabinet. Investigators then searched the front of the room and discovered a pair of jeans and a red and white floral-patterned shirt, both stained with blood. Among the books in Reed and Luckman's room, they found a photo album filled with human hair samples glued to each page, labeled with the donor's name and body part. They also found dozens of books on Satanism, including the Devil's Prayer Book, the Satanic Bible, and History of Witchcraft. While investigators searched the barracks, police radio broadcast that Reed and Luckman had been arrested and were being held at the Glen Innes police station. Immediately after receiving this information, investigators collected evidence from the suspect's room and drove to Glen to interrogate Luckman and Reed. During questioning, both gave contradictory stories, mostly blaming each other, and Terry Ryan, the boy they had trusted but who had instead turned them in. Later that night, both men were formally charged with the murder of Peter Aston, assault, and the attempted murder of Terry Ryan. The next morning, Reed and Luckman appeared in court. During the hearing, investigators requested bail be denied and for them to be sent back to Tweed Heads. The following day, investigators took Reed on a tour of the crime scene. Reed was a tall, well-built man wearing jeans, a cowboy shirt, and flat-soled cowboy boots. He was so vain that he genuinely believed he had the situation under control, regardless of the circumstances. On the way, he asked the officers to stop and buy him a box of matches. When they handed it to him, he immediately put a matchstick in his mouth and chewed it like a cowboy, explaining the chewed matches found at the grave. He probably thought it made him look cool. Upon arrival, Reed described the events of that night in great detail. He was very cooperative, proudly recounting everything from start to finish, including all of Luckman and Terry Ryan's actions. He even pointed out where all the weapons had been stashed, and when investigators checked, they were indeed there. Reed basked in his 15 minutes of fame the entire time. The officers played along, praising him for remembering so much. The more they indulged him, the more he strutted around, reconstructing the event step by step. At one point, he even sat on the sand by the grave and laughed, a truly chilling and disgusting sight. Once Reed and Luckman were behind bars, investigators began piecing together why these men had committed such a horrific crime seemingly without motive. Robin Reed was born on October 20, 1948 in Hampshire, England. On January 16, 1961, he immigrated to Australia with his family, settling in Queensland. Reed dropped out of school at 14, working odd jobs as a laborer, painter, and salesman. At some point, he became obsessed with bows, arrows, and knives of all kinds. Reed joined the army in 1972 and eventually ended up at a barracks on the outskirts of Brisbane. There, he rose to the rank of corporal and was tasked with supervising privates. Paul Luckman was born on November 1, 1964, in Melbourne to a broken family. Until age 13, he was raised by his father and stepmother before being taken in by his biological mother, an abusive alcoholic who constantly beat him. According to Luckman, he was allegedly abused for 5 days by 2 men at his mother's house, and he enjoyed it. At 16, he dropped out of school and lived off unemployment benefits, occasionally earning money through unconventional relationships with people of the same sex. He also enjoyed cross-dressing in an attempt to change his life. Paul Luckman enlisted in the army at 17. Upon arrival at the unit, he was assigned to Robin Reed, who immediately charmed him. The young Luckman moved in with him. The combination of Reed's passion for weapons, violence, sadistic fantasies, and Satanism, and Luckman's willingness to follow him into this dark world brought the two together instantly. They had been inseparable ever since. In hindsight, investigators realized it was only a matter of time before the pair attempted to act out their twisted fantasies. On August 4, 1982, the trial of Reed and Luckman began. From the start, media outlets from across Australia and an angry crowd clashed to catch a glimpse of the alleged monster duo who indulged in Satanism, torture, and bizarre rituals, and had murdered a boy. When Peter Aston's older brother, Michael, disappeared from his home in Melbourne after threatening to kill Reed and Luckman, a tactical response team was deployed to monitor everyone entering the courthouse. Rumors also swirled that the murdered boy's mother entered the courthouse armed with a knife. Though she sat just an arm's length from Reed during the trial, she refrained from using it. Given the severity of the charges, the case was referred to the Supreme Court of Sydney. The trial began on November 8, 1982. Paul Luckman pleaded not guilty. Robin Reed also pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity. Peter Aston's injuries were so horrific that the prosecution decided not to show the jury photos of the deceased. Since there was no doubt Reed and Luckman had killed Peter Aston, the court focused on determining which defendant had played the leading role in the atrocity. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Luckman was trying to shift blame onto Reed. Among numerous accusations, Luckman claimed he had been forced to participate in all the horrors under threat of death by Reed. Reed, meanwhile, began his defense by stating that his abnormal orientation had caused him great stress, because if his superiors had found out, he would have been discharged from the army. He also claimed that work pressures and his obsession with the occult led him to hear voices, which in turn drove him to murder. Despite the pair's claims, Terry Ryan's testimony corroborated all key points of the case. On November 26, 1982, the jury delivered its verdict. Both defendants, Reed and Luckman, were sentenced to life in prison. The presiding judge later stated that their crime was one of the most brutal and heartless ever tried in this state. In prison, Robin Reed was placed in protective custody for his own safety. On November 26, 1998, Reed applied for a sentence review and was again sentenced to life with a non-parole period of 24 years, meaning he wouldn't be eligible for release until 2006. As of June 2014, he had been denied parole 6 times. Though considered the more brutal killer, Luckman was treated with more respect behind bars than Reed. He survived prison by offering his services to fellow inmates in exchange for money and other prison currency. With each passing year, he grew more feminine. In 1989, he began hormone therapy after a psychiatrist determined he resembled a woman more than a man in many ways. A year later, he underwent full gender reassignment surgery in prison and changed his name to Nicole Louise Pierce. On October 26, 1999, she was released from the high-security male facility in inland New South Wales. The years had not been kind to Terry Ryan, the innocent boy Reed and Luckman had dragged into such a nightmare. He became an outcast, mocked and scorned by classmates and society. His life spiraled downward. He served time for assault and car theft. During his sentencing hearing, the court documented that Terry Ryan exhibited anti-authoritarian behavior, struggled with anger, and suffered from substance abuse. Thanks for watching and take care of yourselves.